Today on the Cool Stuff Guys Like channel, I'm going to talk about two-stroke engines and one or two major mistakes that you can make when rebuilding these things that are unique to two-strokes and can essentially destroy that engine. I got to thinking about this when I was gathering up all the parts and pieces to turn this old Husqvarna 257 into a spicy hot rod saw. And even no matter how many times you do this, you could make any one of these mistakes. The first one is going to be, if you look inside a cylinder, these chainsaws have the cylinder and cylinder head kind of as a one-piece unit. But if you look inside there, you'll notice it's a lot different than a four-stroke. A four-stroke's going to have a smooth bore, whereas a two-stroke has your transfer ports on the side. So your bottommost port right here, the carburetor connects to, is going to be your intake port. So when the piston goes up, it creates a vacuum and it sucks that air and fuel mixture into the crankcase. Well, when that piston goes back down, you have these little transfer ports. So it compresses that air fuel mix and blows it up into the combustion chamber, where it can then be compressed and boom, create that explosion to create that power to push that piston back down. And then you've got this high port as well. I don't know if you'll be able to see it here, but it's basically aligned with this dirty, carbon soot covered hole, and that's going to be your exhaust port. So opposite of your intake port and higher on the cylinder is your exhaust port. But because your cylinder isn't smooth, there's something that can go wrong here, and that is if you don't orient your piston and piston rings correctly, it can catch on one of those ports. That piston ring can catch on one of those ports and blow the piston to pieces, score up the cylinder to the point of no return, bang a bunch of aluminum pieces around in that crankcase. And when you see this happen, it's often unrecoverable. It's a total loss. It's probably one of the worst ways you can blow up one of these two-stroke engines. So some pistons are a little bit more obvious than others that there is an orientation. For instance, this little piston is a Meteor brand. It's a pretty reputable aftermarket brand for these chainsaws. And you'll see it's got a little arrow here. So that arrow points towards the exhaust port in this case. And there's a little pin right there that you locate the gap of the piston ring on, and it locks the piston ring in that orientation so that it can't get kind of unclocked from that orientation. Well, if you're looking in this cylinder and you see that, you think, well, isn't that right in line with the intake port, that gap? And isn't that gap going to then catch the intake port and do that exact thing that you just said was going to happen and blow the engine up? Well, no. Most of these two-stroke engines, the way they're factory ported is that when this, I'll see if I can get a little view up inside here. So when this piston goes up and down in that cylinder, it doesn't go down far enough for that ring to peek into that port. And what you'll hear people say when they are porting two-stroke engines is to be very, very careful when you're porting that intake port, because when the piston's all the way down, you want to make sure that you can't see the ring. And if you can, that you can just barely see the ring. Because if that ring goes all the way into that intake port, it could be game over. It's going to kind of spring out just enough on one of those strokes that it's just going to catch, scratch everything up, probably shatter the piston in the process, and just be devastating. Sometimes instead of an arrow, these pistons, especially the older ones like from the 80s and 70s, will just have a dot that indicates it's the exhaust side. Or maybe it'll just say in, like just barely legible on the piston. So it's not always super obvious if you're not thinking. And that's how I said, even if you've done this a bunch of times, you could be in a hurry, you might not be thinking straight, and you could make this mistake. There's one more major two-stroke failure off the top of my head that's unique to two-strokes. And I'm sure there's a lot more, but just me thinking about it a little bit, these are my two. And by the way, if you have some more, I'd love to hear in the comments, or if any of these problems have happened to you, share your experiences with them. But the second one is, you heard me mention that the air-fuel mixture comes in the intake port and into the crankcase. So two-stroke doesn't have oil in the crankcase like a four-stroke. It sucks the fuel air mix in there, and there's oil mixed in with that fuel, so that lubricates everything down there. So you might underappreciate the crank seals on a two-stroke because it's not going to drip oil. It's not like a four-stroke where if a crank seal goes bad, you've got a big puddle of oil on the floor. But don't underappreciate these little seals. So these little seals on the end of the crankshaft, what their extra helpful purpose is sealing that crankcase from air leakage. So you don't want air leaking when you're compressing that fuel air charge. It's going to leak some out. It's just going to kind of throw off the saw or the dirt bike or the snowmobile or whatever it is. But when you really don't want air leaking is when that piston's going up and it's sucking that air-fuel mixture in, because it's going to suck in more air and it's going to create a lean condition where it's got more air than it wants, and it has more air particles for the same amount of fuel particles. And a lean engine is a dangerous engine. It is usually runs super hot, often runs super good, but not for long, and it'll usually melt a piston. I had a sneaky failure like this when I was a kid. One of my two-cylinder snowmobiles, one of the two cylinders was always running just a little bit leaner than the other ones. When you check the spark plugs, you're looking for that kind of tan, light brown color that tells you your fuel air mixture is pretty good. Well, one of the two cylinders was always just a little bit leaning more towards that gray, kind of unhappy zone. So I couldn't figure it out. It was before the internet was really full of all this information. I kept rejetting the carburetor richer and richer, and take it out in the field, everything would look good. I'd get it out on the road where it's not under a lot of load, but it's under a lot of RPM, and sure enough, it would burn up a piston. So I'd rebuild it. And sooner or later, some old guy told me that about these crank seals and that this could be a problem, and had to tear the whole thing apart, down to the flywheel. And sure enough, I replaced the crank seal and everything ran like a top. It was one of the crispest, nicest running engines after that. But that was definitely a lesson learned, and it just tells you, what logic applies when you're rebuilding a four-stroke. While a lot of that carries over to a two-stroke, you really got to think through kind of how that engine is working to diagnose some of these problems. They're not going to be like, check mark, this is the problem. It's going to be sometimes something a little funny that's going on with these engines. I hope this is helpful for you, and if you want to see this Husqvarna 257 spicy saw build, stay tuned and subscribe to my channel. Basically what I'm going to do is take this thing and put a big bore cylinder, so a 262 XP cylinder will fit on this crankcase. Maybe do a little porting, maybe open up the exhaust, maybe do a little timing advance. We'll see. I want to make this a pretty rowdy saw, but I also don't want to make it unreliable. So I'd love to hear some suggestions from you guys on what I should do to this old, well-used, well-loved saw. And I hope this was helpful, and thanks for watching.